Hello, I am your host, Karen Doyle, and welcome to the Genius Podcast. The Genius Podcast is part of a much bigger initiative for Catholic women called the Genius Project. The heart of the Genius Project is dedicated to equipping and supporting women of all ages and stages of life to discover what it is that God has placed within their hearts to do, giving them the permission to follow that God whisper and dream, and then equipping them with the knowledge and practical skills to make it happen. One of the core pillars of the Genius Project is supporting women in their vocation. We all have a universal vocation. This involves our universal call to love as God loves. After this, we have a primary vocation. This is how we choose to live out our universal call to love, either through marriage, consecrated life, or in single life. And finally, we have a secondary or an individual vocation, as Edith Stein teaches us. In this vocation, we are looking what is truly uniquely ours to bring, what it is that we as individuals are called to bring to life. In today's podcast, we are going to explore how as women we can grow in our primary vocation, specifically within marriage. This podcast is not just for married women. While in this podcast we're dealing specifically with marriage, a lot of these insights into understanding men and navigating relationships with men can be applied across the board to people we work with, our brothers, our fathers, and those men that we do life with on a regular basis. Walking with hundreds of women over the years and speaking at men's conferences on relationships and marriage, I have come to the conclusion that many individuals are poorly formed. And when it comes to marriage, and once they get married, too many couples are not supported in their vocation of marriage. One of my key sayings when speaking on this topic is to remind people of the need to create an atmosphere of love. An atmosphere in which both individuals can flourish. Today's Genius guest is the wonderful Francine Pirola. Francine has been a close friend of mine for the past 17 years and a true sister in the Lord. Along with her husband Byron, they have a number of ministries and apostolates, all geared toward the support and the formation of marriage and the family. Together they have over 40 years experience helping people build marriages which are emotionally, sexually and spiritually healthy. All of their work is deeply formed by the theology of the body and seeks to integrate Catholic theology with insights and frameworks from modern psychology and relationship theory. And this is what makes it immensely powerful. Through online courses, conferences, and multimedia resources, Francine has helped thousands of couples prepare for marriage and work through the many trials that couples inevitably face. She is a regular speaker at the Sisterhood Catholic Women's Conference on topics relating to marriage, family planning, and sexual intimacy. So whether you're married, you're preparing for marriage, or you simply want to understand men, I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Francine. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of marriage, and we're really exploring and unpacking in this series of the Genius podcast, I guess, living our genius and the genius of womanhood within our various vocations and dimensions of our life. And what I'd really love to talk to you about is how we do that specifically within the vocation of marriage. A lot of people know you and Byron for the work that you've done in marriage preparation, but can you just break down the online courses that you have available? Obviously you do the marriage prep, but when you're talking about this breakthrough experience, you have marriage enrichment and the breakthrough experience. Like how many different courses have you got, just so people are aware?
Yeah, sure. We've got an increasing suite of them. So there's the engaged course, and then paired with that is what we call the sponsor course. So that's the same curriculum, but just without all the time locks and assessments and things. But a married couple, and every engaged couple gets a coupon code for a sponsor couple, so they can invite somebody from their parish if they wish. It's an optional uptake to get access to the sponsor course, and then the two couples just do the course in parallel and get together to talk about it. So that's the ideal context for an engaged couple preparation, is they have a married couple accompany them to talk through the issues and track the course with them. But it doesn't require that. It's an optional thing. We then have a fertility course. Then we have the marriage kit, which is a marriage enrichment just a basic, simple introductory course. We've just about to launch a little short workshop. There's a breakthrough, and then there's another short workshop on theology of the body for couples.
Fantastic. Wow.
And we're working on a newlywed course, which we'll be launching in another month.
So that is a comprehensive package. I love it. It's good. Yeah, well, that's good. And I think that's what we need, isn't it? Like just a library and a hub where people know that they can go there to get resourced and to get help.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though, like, all the courses are self-directed, so it's a classic online environment where you log in, you purchase your course, you get instant access, and off you go. Yeah. We do offer optional coaching. So if people want to book a single or a block of 3 coaching sessions, they can add that into the course. And at the moment, I'm doing all of those coaching sessions, so I can meet with them at their convenience, usually by Skype or Google Hangouts or whatever they prefer, or FaceTime, whatever works for them. And then I can take them through or explain things, or if they want to talk things through a little bit with a person outside of the relationship, they've got that option.
And sometimes it's really helpful to do that. The other thing I wanted to come back to was when you said, you were talking about sometimes we all have toxic periods or times that aren't great in our marriage where we can be at each other's throats. And I think that's a really important thing, and maybe that's where we could launch into just discussing how we bring our genius as women to marriage, because I think back to when Jonathan and I were first married. We've been married almost 19 years. And I remember those first 3 months, we hadn't lived together and we're quite strong people. So we tended to hit heads a little bit. And I remember looking around at all the other couples thinking, oh my goodness, they've all got like these perfect relationships. What's wrong with us? And I remember going to a New Year's Eve party and making a joke about some disagreement we'd had. And all these other couples started sharing about their experience. Now, you would never have thought that they would have struggled in a particular area, or that they would have argued, or that they had some colossal fights. I remember one girl said she sat in the bath for 6 months wondering what she'd done. What I took away from that is that we don't talk enough about the reality of marriage. Like, marriage is often presented as this lovely, happily ever after, and everyone works towards the wedding day as if that's the culmination, where actually the wedding day is only the beginning. And so when we're looking at marriage, I think for Jonathan and I, that conversation was really enlightening, just to get an insight into other people's lives. And we made the promise that we would never, not that we, you don't want to be airing all your dirty laundry to everybody, but it would be a level of honesty and authenticity about our relationship, and so that people realised this is a normal part of life. Marriage comes with, yes, all its joys and its highs, but it also comes with a lot of struggle. And once you add children and a mortgage and business and career and whatever else, throw in cancer or depression or financial trouble, like that's the point where you've really got to get about the job of building a love that's going to see you through a lifetime. And I think, and as we have this discussion, I'm always conscious of the women that I walk with whose marriages are not healthy, whose husbands are actually quite toxic. So as we have this discussion, I guess I need to say that what we're generally referring to is a generally healthy relationship, because people, I guess, that are in toxic or abusive relationships, you don't apply the same rules because there's a different set of circumstances at play.
Yeah. So, look, we should unpack that a little bit, but firstly, just about your earlier comment, totally agree, is that we don't, again, that balance between not sort of letting everything hang out, but also in the right environment being really honest about what the reality of our relationships are like. In our marriage seminars, I think that is hands down some of the strongest feedback we get from couples, is that, oh my gosh, it's so good to know we're normal. They've been struggling with these issues for years, thinking that their relationship was doomed because pretty much everybody wants everybody there to celebrate the wedding, but as soon as there's difficulty, we close the doors and nobody sees anything until we make the announcement we're breaking up.
Absolutely.
So that kind of, I think there's a real call and a ministry amongst Catholic couples in to actually take the leadership and being honest about their struggles and growth in that, in the context of obviously being respectful of their privacy, and also respectful towards each other, so that we're not running each other's down. Sometimes that kind of trying to get support or deal with our difficulties, and I've been certainly guilty of this, it can be a really dysfunctional way of just blurting it out and venting in a way that is disrespectful to
Absolutely.
Byron.
I can recall there's this one mother at school who will never listen to this podcast, so it's okay. But she would be on the playground just openly talking about some very big struggles that her husband had and how it impacts her.
Yeah.
I would cringe. I was like, oh, it's just not the right place to do this.
Yeah.
But in the right context, it's really important. And I think that whole idea of being mentored, that we just expect that people will get married, that they come from totally different families of origin, they have totally different personalities, one might be an introvert, one might be an extrovert, they will have completely different ways of approaching everything in life, from sex to money to communication to how they want to relax or who's going to raise the children, and we just expect that they're going to say I do and then live happily ever after, and we forget that marriage takes a lot of work. And so I'd love to talk with you because, I know this is a real strength of yours, just around the ways that we as women can, I guess, grow in our capacity as wives and that vocation to love. I know that when I speak at the men's conference, we make a joke and I talk to them about understanding the heart of a woman, and we make the joke that it actually is possible, because they look at me rather skeptically that it's possible to understand a woman's heart. I say, well, they feel the same about you. But we've had a lot of fun unpacking it. But I often say to them that it's not so much our differences that are the problem as it is our perception of those differences. And I think a lot of our problem comes in that we don't know how to come alongside one another in life in a way that's complementary, but also we lose sight of the fact that marriage is not just a functional partnership, it's a vocation, and a vocation is a call, and specifically it is the call to love as Christ loves. So we're human, so we're selfish and we get annoyed and all of those things, but trying to keep that eternal perspective of, like, my marriage, this is like the marriage relationship is the one that, is the best analogy for how God pursues us as people and draws us to himself, the bride and the bridegroom. And so if we're not seeing God's love in marriage, like, where are we going to see it in the world? And so I think as women, like, it's not to say we have to do this, because I know some women get their back up about, well, if you just did this or had more sex with him, he'd be happy. It's definitely not that conversation. But more, what can we do? What can we bring? How can we grow in our capacity to love? So I guess, I don't know, in your work, what are the key areas? I guess let's start with the differences, because these are the areas where people get really ticked off and that's where they get problems. This idea of not knowing how to come alongside one another. So what would you see as, I guess, maybe the top 5 differences between men and women, and then we can maybe flesh out these topics?
So we would kind of, I guess, advocate that the number one difference to appreciate is in the way that we experience love. Because at the end of the day, if we're feeling loved and connected to each other, we can tolerate a whole lot of other deficiencies. And basically, when we look back to when we were dating and, we're in the love bubble and the hormones are going crazy and the neurotransmitters are firing and we're getting all that euphoria and limerence effect, which is a lovely experience, we were still very flawed, imperfect people. But we tolerated it in each other. We didn't kind of punish each other when we were late, because we were just so happy to see him when he did turn up.
And you can overlook those things.
That's right. Now, when he's late, I'm like furious with him. So it's a lot of the time is, I guess, remembering that if we're feeling loved and connected, we can ride over a lot of those bumps. But we do experience love quite uniquely, and there is some gender bias, but even within those broad gender differences or sexual differences, there is a unique profile for every individual. So one of the first things we teach couples in our courses is about the unique love profile and how to identify that. And it really is taking a mentality to our relationship. It's almost like an investigative reporter. Like, my job is to study you, Byron, and work out what specifically makes you feel loved and connected and valued and respected. And if I can do that, I can look for clues. I can see what he responds to. I can look for what he gives me feedback on. So if he's, expressing appreciation, that tells me, okay, hit the mark there. If there's no positive feedback, I could probably say maybe that doesn't make so much of a difference. But if I'm kind of turn my mindset towards my mission is to love you and to discover the ways that are most effective, and then to love you that way, because the reality is that we just assume that the other person experiences love the way we do.
Yeah.
And so we'll love by instinct and then get frustrated when it's not effective, when he rejects. So my classic example for me is that I feel loved when I'm, troubled by something, if somebody just sits and listens to me and lets me talk and so on. And so if Byron comes home from work and I can see he's distracted or whatever, and I'll say, do you want to talk about it? You look like you're worried about something. Do you want to talk about it? His answer is almost always, no, I'm okay. But I never accept that, right? Then
no, of course.
I wheel around. 5 minutes later, I'm wheeling around for another attempt. And it's not going to break through because it's not how he feels loved. He feels more loved if I just say, let me give you some space. You look like you need some thinking time.
Yes, which is totally the opposite to us, because we want them to move in and give us a hug in that moment.
That's it. Exactly right. Exactly.
So then when we pursue them to do the same, they feel smothered and get really annoyed.
Exactly. So that's part of the mission, I think, is to learn their unique love profile and to love them that way. And we call that framework smart loving. And it's sort of pretty self-explanatory. It's it's smart because you're not burning energy doing things that are not going to make a difference. And therefore, because that you can build resentment around that, I do all this work trying to show you that I love you and nothing seems to make an impact. Well, instead of blaming him for that, take a look at ourselves and say, am I doing the wrong sort of things? Am I loving out of instinct rather than loving out of intention?
And I think that's so true. And I think the other thing is, like, I know for us, say after we'd been married 10 years, you criticize each other, or, you might say something to the other person and you interpret it as criticism. And the one thing I've learned, which has been really helpful, is instead of being hurt by the criticism, to go, okay, what is underneath this complaint? Like, what is he trying to communicate to me? Because, yes, it might not come across, and I certainly might not come across that way to Jonathan. It might appear that I'm criticizing him, but underneath all our criticisms is a complaint or an area that we're dissatisfied with. So I think one thing that we can do as women is to really, and our husbands too, to step back and have a look at what is the complaint and how can I respond? Is it fair? How can I adjust to really love you, which is what you're saying.
Yes, there's two sides to that. Is how do we make a respectful request for a change in behaviour, and how do we receive it? Because we'll always do it, even when you've got the theory, we'll still do it clumsily because we'll be emotionally charged and we'll be often reacting out of irritation. So proactively, he's doing something that's annoying us. How do you make a respectful request? I think the first thing is to not just blurt it out, is to take a bit of space to think about it and get in touch with, there's always, I guess, what we psychologists and us call the harsh feelings and the softer feelings. And the harsh feelings are things like irritation, frustration, anger, that kind of thing. They're in some ways a conditioned response. They're a defense mechanism. If you can put that aside and go a little bit deeper, you'll find there's softer feelings like I'm feeling hurt, I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling inadequate, I'm feeling undermined and disempowered. So if you can get in touch with the softer feelings and own those, then when we start the conversation, it can be, I guess, a more rational kind of conversation that goes along the lines of, look, when you do X, Y, Z, the impact it has on me is that I feel like this. I might react angrily towards you, but when I think about it, what I'm really feeling is I'm feeling really alone and unsupported in that. What would really help me is when this situation comes up, if you did this instead of that. So I've given him, I'm not blaming him. I'm not sort of saying I'm not judging him, saying you're a terrible person. I'm actually owning my reaction to it and being really honest and authentic about what's really happening to me. And then I'm giving him a solution. I mean,
Absolutely.
most husbands will go, "Oh, easy. You want
Thank
me to do
you.
A instead of B?"
Because I think
Done.
we are so guilty of expecting them to be mind readers and having a little sulk when
Yes.
they don't get it, and they
Yeah.
just don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And instead of
that's
saying,
a good
"Hey, you
tip.
pig, do you think you could pick up your clothes occasionally?" Right? The contempt in that just puts him on the defensive. He's not
Absolutely.
sure what like there's no context, there's no specific instance that we're referring to. That's just destructive all around. So if we can kind of, take on a situation like that, if that happens to be your circumstance or whatever it is, reflect on it, connect with those softer feelings, and so that we're discharging the immediate defensive reactionary anger.
Yeah.
And then take that into the relationship. That's actually an intimacy builder. That's the kind of thing that's net positive experience, where he will probably spontaneously say, "Oh, my darling, I'm so sorry, I had no idea." I would be very happy to do that. But that's more likely his response compared to,
Yes.
triggering a defense reaction in him.
Absolutely. And I think that leads us into this whole idea of respect. So, you're talking about, I guess, love and how we experience love differently. And I guess there's some top areas where we are actually really different. Like a couple come to mind. One's communication, respect,
Yes.
sex, the power of the tongue. These are the kinds of things where I think my experience has been women really appreciate, I guess, those insights into men, what makes them tick, and what do they need? What do they actually want in relationship? What's helpful? So I guess why don't we start with communication, because this is a big one. You touched on it, but in terms of, I guess, your work in this area and I guess our own marriages, how are we different? How do men and women experience communication differently?
Yeah. We use the word communication a lot, but I actually prefer to use the word connection, because connection has that sense, it's a little bit broader.
Yeah.
And communication tends to make us think about the words and the verbal kind of dimension. And as we know, we talk about nonverbal communication as everything that's not verbal, which includes body language and physical gestures and touch and actions of service and things like that. So it sort of covers it, but it's sort of in contrast to, like, it's a sort of a negative, when we say non-verbal communication, it's a negative definition. It's a definition of differentiation from verbal communication. So I kind of think, and connection is a little bit more of a, at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to achieve. We want to feel close and connected to each other. And I guess communion might be a kind of a more slightly religious term, but and that kind of just broadens it a little bit. And I think in our observations in the work, we find it sort of resonates with people, is that women will rely on sort of intimate verbal conversation as their primary means for establishing a sense of connection with another person.
Yes.
Whereas men don't rely primarily on intimate conversation. They'll use conversation more pragmatically.
Yeah.
They still talk a lot. It's not about how many words they say. There are a lot of men that do a lot of talking, but they're organising, they're establishing data transfer, they're establishing their leadership in a situation or whatever. They're using communication not so much to establish intimacy, but to manage and organise a situation.
Yeah.
For intimacy, I think they're more likely to express that through acts of service, physical contact, including sex and lovemaking.
Yeah.
They're more of their primary way that they'll feel really connected, particularly when we're talking about the marriage relationship.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why I think we often see men gravitating into sports that involve a lot of physical contact, like, tackle football and stuff like that. That physical contact is actually a really important part of bonding. For men. It's not to say women, we give each other hugs and hold each other's hands and pat each other on the back and, cry with each other and so on. So it's not that physical contact's not important to us, but I guess it's more a difference of emphasis. So we like to make the analogy of being right and left-handed. We've all got a dominant hand. In my case, it's my right hand. It doesn't mean my left hand's irrelevant. I need both hands to carry a box or to do up a shoelace.
Yes.
But if I'm going to do something that requires dexterity, my right hand is dominant, so that's the one I rely on more.
Yeah.
And so it's a little, I think if we take that kind of mentality to it, it's sort of like a dominance rather than an exclusive thing.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
helpful to appreciate that, because what it does is that it then opens up this framework that we call desire discrepancy, which is where we get a lot of hurt in it. So I didn't mean to cut you off, but just on a bit of a roll.
Please go for it. It's good.
So when you've got these differences in the way that we connect, it automatically puts one of us into a situation of the high desire spouse into a situation of inferiority to the other. So in the case of intimate conversation, I have a higher need and a higher desire for that than Byron. So therefore, he's the gatekeeper on it. He doesn't need it as much. So he controls how much intimate conversation happens in our relationship. It's not intentional. He doesn't seek to assert that as in itself. It's just the nature of it. Because I need it more, I'm more dependent on it. It makes me vulnerable to that. Equally for him, he's more dependent on the physical touch and the sexual expression in our relationship. I don't require it as much. I've got lower testosterone levels. Therefore, I have the control over that aspect of our relationship. And so for Catholic couples particularly, or Christian couples, I think what we're really called to is to recognise that imbalance is there, but then to be proactive as the low desire spouse in each of those situations in surrendering our control. And that means being proactive. So for Byron, it means initiating intimate conversation, looking for the cues for me when I'm indicating that I want to talk more, and being receptive and encouraging that. For me, that means being proactive in initiating lovemaking and being responsive to his touch, so that I'm honouring that fact that, this desire that he has, and he's honouring the desires that I have for communion and intimacy.
And I think that one, it's so true. That one, and just hone in on the topic of sex, because everyone's interested in sex, right? But that one's a big one, because I think people, some of the women that I walk alongside find that for whatever reason, a really challenging area, and they don't understand it. And they can think that their husbands, I don't know, I've actually sadly heard one lady describe it as, this animalistic desire, which is really sad, because it's given to us by God to draw us together. It's a beautiful gift. But I guess it's not so much just about a physical release or expression. It's really an emotional need. So I think
it is.
Making that distinction for women, I think, is really, really important, especially younger women who are going into marriage, who might be discerning that, or newly married, to understand that sexual intimacy isn't just a physical thing or event. It's a deep emotional need, isn't it? Like, it builds their self-esteem. It makes them feel connected.
Yes,
is that
absolutely.
you agree with?
Absolutely. And it's really reframing, because the culture tells us that sex is just an activity. It's something we do for fun. It's an it. We talk about doing it. It's recreational, therefore we both should be enjoying it. It's all about the pleasure outcomes and so on. Whereas the church really calls us to approach sex very differently, to think about it as a communication, as a way of connection, of bringing about communion. And in fact, if you go more deeply into the theology of the body, the lovemaking is actually is sacramental. It's the sacramental gesture that validates the vows we make on our wedding day. And so it's actually, when you get into that mindset, lovemaking is as important as I guess for Catholics, it's as important as going to communion. As going to mass.
Wow, you're putting it up there. that's right up there.
Well, if you've got a vocation of matrimony,
I can just hear all their men going, "Thank you, Francine."
happy to take the praise. But that is core to it. I mean, we know that. I mean, even in secular society, if the marriage isn't consummated, it's legally not a valid marriage. That's always been the case, quite apart from what the Catholic Church has taught. But it's actually also true in the Catholic Church as well, that if the marriage is never consummated, it's considered invalid. And so sex is central to the expression of marriage. We sort of know that, but then I think because we've just got this overlay of this hyper-eroticized culture, pornified culture, that's telling us all the time that sex is just this, getting your rocks off, or what, I don't want to use crude language, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's what it's done is it's actually, it's desanctified lovemaking, it's debased it. And so it's really hard when you're in that culture to then remember that actually no, lovemaking is central to our spiritual connection as a couple.
Absolutely.
And part of our vocational call.
Absolutely. And that's what I was talking about, this eternal perspective, like bringing, like heaven isn't this pie in the sky idea. Like, you know, we can bring a bit of heaven to earth right here and now. Like, we're called to bear Christ's image right here and now, wherever we are planted. So, you know, to our husbands, our children, in our workplace. And this is one of the ways that we do that. So I think it's so important for us as women to just be coming before the Lord and really maintaining that eternal perspective. And
so agree.
Yeah.
So agree that we've lost that eternal perspective, I think, in our culture. We don't get I'm not suggesting we go back to the old fire and brimstone sermons where we get threatened with eternal damnation if we don't follow the rules.
Yes.
But I think we have lost that sense of there's an eternal goal here. This is not just about my happiness here in this life. It's kind of like her happiness horizon has shrunk down to, am I happy right here, right now? And if I'm not happy now, my needs, my happiness is my right, and I'm going to pursue that at all costs. Yeah. And so it's a devaluing of the spiritual benefits and value of forbearance and suffering and so on, which is really a big part of, I guess, the Christian tradition of being able to transform suffering into I guess, towards spiritual goals. And we know that the Lord allows suffering in our lives. He's not punishing us, but suffering is one of the ways that we mature and become holier. And so part of this applies in marriage. One of the things that we find really resonates with couples, we look at arguments and difficulties in a marriage, and people kind of, we approach those as their problems, and this, we kind of try to reframe it and say, look, anytime you've got friction in your relationship, that's a growing pain. That's an invitation into growth. Don't kind of try and, I'm not saying don't go looking for them, like don't try and pick fights.
Not a good idea.
But recognise that when you've got differences and you're experiencing tension and trouble, that's an invitation to become a better person, to grow in virtue individually. And if you kind of take that approach, you then start to appreciate, marriage is a pathway to holiness. And you're not going to get holier if it's all smooth sailing and you're all perfectly compatible and there's no differences and there's never any arguments. That's not a growth institution. That's just a kind of a stagnation.
Yes. And that's another thing. I think people forget that marriage is actually an evolution. It's not like it's not like an event that happens and that's what you stay in for the rest of your life. Like it's a never-ending evolution, because we're constantly evolving as people. Like who I was 20 years ago is not who I am now. Same for Jonathan. And things that, you know, say whatever wounds or things that we brought into marriage, we had no way of understanding those back then. But over the years, I think the key in marriage particularly is to grow together and to be evolving together. And I do see this a lot, that when people run into problems, it's because there's not a receptivity to growth, to evolving and to doing that process together. I think that's a real key in building a healthy marriage and a godly marriage, is to realise that marriage is an evolution and that we have to go together. We have to grow together through.
Yeah. And in fact, look, we've done talks on that. We've actually borrowed the idea from Dr. John Van Epp in the United States, a Christian marriage educator. But he does a lot of work with singles that are in the rebound around how not to get into another toxic relationship. And he does a great little workshop, which I think is really helpful, where he points out that, you know, we've got all these, what are the qualities you want in a marriage partner? Thinking about, you know, the future father or mother of your children, not just somebody to go on a date with, but, you know, long-term thinking, building a life with. And, you know, people come up with things like we want honesty, we want somebody with a work ethic, somebody who's going to be faithful, who's got a sense of humour and so on, all good things. No debate about those. But he then sort of challenges people to say, well, where are you on those? And none of us are going to be perfect. We're all works in progress. So the key quality that you're looking for is not that somebody is super honest or super patient or whatever it is. You actually want somebody who's open to growth. And the deal breaker is if you're dating somebody and there's no evidence that they're prepared to grow and change. That's going to be a problem relationship. You want to get out of there quick.
Yeah.
He calls it a persistent resistance to change, which is a bit of a mouthful. So I kind of do it in the positive and say the key quality you want is an openness to growth.
Yes.
Because if we're open to growth, any shortcomings or deficiencies that we have, there's hope that will time be addressed.
Yeah.
But if I'm kind of completely closed and you're always the problem, I'm perfect, classic kind of narcissistic, I guess, personality, victim mentality, whatever, everybody else is always at fault. That's really hard to live with because
and you can't go anywhere with that, can you? Like it's just a bit of a dead end. But yeah, it's tricky. My gosh, there's so many topics just here to talk about. I'm conscious of time too, like probably in the next 5 minutes as we sort of wrap up, just give me a couple of, I guess, pearls of wisdom that you could offer to women around, I guess, the area, particularly, say, respect, affirmation, those kinds of areas about how we can really grow.
Yeah. Respect is really important for men. Yeah. And one of the things that I guess the way we think of it is that we kind of say, look, there's two rough ways that people experience love. One is through cherishment and the other is through respect. Women primarily experience love through cherishment and men through respect. And St. Paul in his letter to the Ephesians was picking that up. He talked about love, but if you look at the definition of love as he gave it, it's actually a dictionary definition of cherishment. Okay. Keeps a memory in mind, cares for tenderly, treats as a sort of a treasure, as something's very precious and valuable. These are kinds of definitions you get when you cherish something. Those are the sorts of things is that you think about them often and you protect them and so on. I kind of hear those definitions and say, oh, yes, that's how I want to be loved. I'll have more of that.
Yes.
Respect coming from the Latin roots or the Greek roots of the spectacles to see, speaks more around bringing, I guess, an attitude of seeing the goodness in the person, even though the external behaviour might be somewhat contradictory, being prepared to see them with the eyes that God sees them, the internal goodness that might be struggling to be visible, bringing with it that sense of honouring the other person. So men respond really strongly to admiration, I guess Byron will often it's the absence of respect or the absence of cherishment that is more pointed than the actual
disrespect
doing it. So if I disrespect Byron, that wounds him deeply rather than and I do that through criticism.
Yeah.
Through particularly he'll say it's when something goes wrong and he accepts that he messes up and things go wrong, but it's the assumption that he had a malicious intention. Yes. So it's the judgment of his intention that really cuts. Because he says, I know I make mistakes. I never do it intentionally. I would never intentionally try to hurt you.
No.
So then I draw the conclusion, this went wrong. He's a dickhead. He doesn't care about me or whatever it is. Yeah. That's really wounding to him. Yes. So I guess suspending judgment as women, expressing our admiration. Sometimes we think it, but we don't really say it. So I think getting into the habit of praising our husbands, particularly praising him in front of others, is really valuable. I see Byron respond physically sometimes when I'm, talking about how proud I am of him and what he's accomplished in front of his family or some of his work colleagues or so on. I can physically detect changes in his posture. He might not even be aware of it himself, but that's kind of really quite effective, I think.
Yeah, we've got a beautiful, our closest friends, the wife particularly. I think one of the signature things about her, which most people who would meet her would say, is that she is constantly affirming her husband. It's really beautiful. Like it's a habit that she's growing in.
Yes.
And I think this is it. Like when we're talking about
that's a good habit.
It doesn't come naturally. And sometimes we have to lean in and apply ourselves and learn and be really intentional about practicing it so that it becomes a habit in our life.
Absolutely. And that's part of having an intentional marriage, is you can't do everything at once. So just pick that off as one
small
thing.
thing.
Say, for the month of whatever it is, I'm going to make a point of praising my husband every day.
Yeah.
And that whole, that kind of mindset shift of applying that discipline eventually becomes ingrained in second nature, just like cleaning your teeth or any other habit. You have to kind of make a dedicated effort, and don't try and do too much at once.
No, I think we get overwhelmed, don't we? So I
do.
That's a really good point. I think
Yeah.
sort of, I guess, in doing these Genius podcasts, we wrap up by looking at, I guess, an action plan, or how can you put into practice, I guess, some of the things that we're talking about. And I think that's a really good piece of advice, is choose one area.
Daily appreciation.
Yeah, it's a great one. Just to really think about one thing that you could do this week, or grow in terms of loving your husband. I know for myself, this is the area I'm growing in at the moment, is I was an eldest child, and I tend to I function at a high level. So I have I'm quite resilient emotionally. So last year when Jonathan had his accident, I basically had to do everything. And then early this year, as he started to heal and he was able to do more, I was still operating as if he had, both his wrists broken, was in plaster, and where I had to do everything. And it was interesting how he just felt disempowered in little ways by that. And it was nothing malicious on my part. It was just, I ran the kids to school and I did the business. I even had to bath him and drive him everywhere. So it was everything. And so for myself, I've had to be really intentional about taking a step back and just letting him go with things. Like, for instance, he wants to build a wall in our living room at the moment. I was like, I don't think you should do that. I'm worried about his hands. Or I'm like, I'm not sure that will look that good. But anyway, my intentionality has been to go, okay, if it looks absolutely crap, then we'll take it down. But I'm sure it'll look good. But just to, I guess, give some power and respect back to him. So that's my area of growing at the moment, is just to really.
Oh, that's good.
Because I think once we have children too, we tend to hyperfunction because we have to carry a lot as wives and mothers.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think sometimes our husbands can feel like another child. So it's
and that's a classic dynamic, is that because we feel unsupported in a particular area where it's caring for the children or the home maintenance or whatever it is, we slip into that over responsibility drive, and we don't realise we're pushing and shutting out the other person. Even if they wanted to be involved, sometimes they can have a measure of indifference and irresponsibility and sort of absenteeism as well that drives it, but we don't create an environment that's conducive to them coming in. And it's things like, if you're wanting to be involved, you've got to be prepared to let him choose what the kids are going to wear, and maybe he's going to put stripes with polka dots.
Well, it's
you're going to go, oh, I'm embarrassed.
This is not good, but I'm going to bite my tongue.
Absolutely, yep.
Because same thing, like second week of school, Jonathan wanted to take the kids down the coast, and I was like, it's cold, they'll get a cold, it's second week back, they really should have a rest. And I was like, Karen, if he wants to have time with his kids, who are you to be stopping that? Like, that's nuts. Like, there's so many dads who are not involved in their kids' lives. And so Olivia and I stayed at home and had a nice time, and the other two went off with Jonathan, and they just had the best time. And it's like empowering them as well. So they're good lessons for us all, aren't they?
They are. And I guess there's I guess the image for me that I'm trying to work with at the moment is holding things lightly. I think my growth area for this year is really taking on board that I don't have to control the outcomes of everything, that I can bring effort and investment and bring all my gifts and care into a situation, but to hold it lightly. So a bit of that kind of detachment from the outcome, so that I'm not as intense and also not as emotionally overwrought when things don't go quite the way I want. So it's really, that's my thing, I think, is to just hold things lightly. And I need to do that with our relationship a little bit as well, and admire and be in the relationship without me trying to control how he participates or over defining what I want him to be in this relationship. Just sort of letting him have some freedom around expressing his love and himself in our relationship.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Yeah. Oh, it's such a journey. I know that Jonathan and I have been so grateful for yours and Byron's witness and friendship in our life and our marriage. It's been such a
Likewise.
gift. So yeah, and we're just so grateful. Your ministry and the ministry to people who are married is just such a gift. It's incredible. And I hope that people listening to this can really benefit and get involved. I wanted to finish off with a quote from John Paul II, and it's one that I really love, and it sort of brings all of this together. And he says, at every moment of history, life will depend on who she will be for him and on who he will be for her. And I think that's it. Just as we take this away, there are areas where our husbands fail us. There are areas where some men are really toxic in their marriages. And in terms of just bringing it back to those healthy relationships, because talking about unhealthy ones is a whole different podcast, which we'll do as well.
Yes.
But
we can do that. Happy to do that later.
Yeah, that'd be great. But just the generally healthy relationships, I guess leaving women with the question, who will you be for him?
Yeah,
I think that's
beautiful.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation with Francine. If you would like to know more about their resources, please visit their website www.marriageresourcecentre.org. And if you are interested in resources to help form young people in the crucial area of sexuality and relationships education, please go and check out the vast array of resources that we have on offer through my husband and my company, Choices Media. www.choices, which is choicez.com.au. These resources are for schools, youth ministers and parents to help them teach the tough topics of human sexuality and relationships, but through a Catholic lens. The final thing that I'd like to share with you is an exciting new online course called Recovery for Her. Recovery for Her is a 6-week online course specifically for women whose lives have been impacted by a partner's sexual infidelity or sexual addiction. If you are interested in this course, please email me at kd@choicez.com.au. Over the next month, we've got some incredible guests lined up for you, so I know that you won't want to miss them. If you like what you've heard on the podcast, please share the link with your friends and leave a review on the podcast platform. It helps to get the word out there. Until next week, have a beautiful week and God bless you.